And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Tonight's weather again showing this low drifting into western Bristol Bay, slowly weakening, and that continues to circulate surges of moisture up in from Kodiak Island into the North Gulf Coast, south central Alaska, and much lighter winds here over the Bering Sea and diminishing winds over the Aleutians. Still a blizzard warning out for the central eastern Arctic coast for tonight. High wind warning out for the central interior for gusts 60 miles per hour. And this system beginning to spread some more rain tomorrow in across the southern southeast coast. Not much in the way of winds. And this system really weakening now along the southwest coast, keeping a lot of snow showers going there, but much lighter winds. Showery for Kodiak Island, mostly cloudy, chance of showers south central Alaska. Better chance here as usual along the southern Kenai Peninsula and North Gulf Coast. Dry over the interior with much lighter winds now, especially in the afternoon toward evening for the Arctic coast and all of interior Alaska, because the next big storm increases the winds over the eastern Aleutians. And on Saturday, this intense low center tracks into the south central Bering Sea, bringing very strong winds. Could see gusts 60 to 85 miles an hour here over the eastern or central Aleutians, all the way up toward Falls Pass, and strong winds increasing here for the southwest coast, pushing across Bristol Bay into the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, northern Bering Sea as well, but lighter winds and a little colder over interior Alaska, as well as south central Alaska and the Copper River Basin. Drier and chillier for the southeast coast. Not too much colder, though, with a risk of a shower right along the outer coastline. Coastal water forecasts on the south coast of the Panhandle for tomorrow, Friday, northeast winds, east-northeast winds, 20 to 25 knots. East-northeast, 15 knots for the central coast, and east 15 to 25 knots for the north coast. Lynn Canal, northeast winds 15 knots, southeast 15 for Stevens Passage. And small craft advisories for Clarence Strait, wind southeast with those seas still up around 13 feet. And for Saturday, on the south coast, north winds 15 to 20 knots, about 10 knots here for the central coast and the north coast, east-northeast at 10 knots, with Lynn Canal north at 15, northeast 15 there for the Stevens Passage area, and northwest at 15 for Clarence Strait with those seas down to 3 feet now and about 13 to 14 feet along the outer coast. And for Prince William Sound, small craft advisories for Friday, southeast winds 25 knots, 6-foot seas there, southeast 20 to 25 knots for the North Gulf Coast, with seas 11 to 12 feet. Cook Inlet, northeast winds 20 knots, seas 4 to 5 feet. Barren Islands, southeast at 20, as well as Kamishak Bay. And for Saturday, increasing the winds here for Kamishak Bay, east increasing to 30 knots, southeast winds increasing to 25 knots for the Barren Islands, and Cook Inlet northeast winds increasing to 15 to 20 knots. Light and variable winds for Prince William Sound with slight seas on Saturday. Same thing for the eastern North Gulf Coast, western coast there, east at 15 knots. Kodiak Island, south to southeast winds 20 knots for Friday, and west winds 30 to 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula, southeast at 30 for Bristol Bay. And for Saturday, gale warnings for the Alaska Peninsula, southeast winds 35 to 40 knots, southeast winds increasing to 40 knots for Bristol Bay, and for Kodiak Island, southeast winds increasing to 30 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians tomorrow, west winds 25 to 30 knots, Adak and Atka southwest 30 to 35 knots. And out here over the Aleutians, mostly variable to north winds at about 20 to 25 knots. And then for Saturday, that low center lifts northward right about into this position here. Very strong winds, high-end storm warnings, west-northwest, 60 knots for the central and west central Aleutians, Adak and Atka. And strong winds also for the eastern Aleutians. Gale and storm force winds there, mostly storm force winds for the Fox Islands out of the south and southwest at 45 to 60 knots, with seas up towards 40 feet on the Pacific side of the islands. And for the southwest coast, tomorrow, variable winds 10 to 15 knots, east at 20 for St. Lawrence Island. Brisk wind advisories, though, for Norton Sound, east winds at 30 knots there, northwest 15 for the Pribilofs, and north 20 for St. Matthew Island. And then for Saturday, east winds increasing to 45 knots for the Pribilof, so seas building to 20 feet. Northeast, 45 knots, St. Matthew Island. Good gales here along the southwest coast, south of Nunivak Island, east at 45 knots. And east at 40 knots for the Yukon Delta coast. Gale warnings for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island. East winds 35 knots. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east winds still looking at gales there for east winds at 35 knots and brisk wind advisors for the central and western coast. Out of the east, 25 to 30 knots, and east winds 20 to 30 knots for the Chukchi Sea. And for Saturday, for the Chukchi Sea here, east winds 25 to 30 knots. Western Arctic coast, brisk wind advisories, east at 25. And the central coast coming down to about 20 knots out of the east. And now lighter winds for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, but still on the brisk side there, east at 25 to 30 knots.